Hello, welcome everyone. We looks like giving people a chance to kind of log in. I'm Andy McNeil with the Compassionate Friends, and we're excited to bring you this special webinar presentation today. This is the first of, well, actually the second of many that we're going to do. We offered one back in December, and this year, our plan is moving from now through the rest of the year. We'll be providing at least one a month, um, if not more opportunities for webinars, for learning, for coming together, getting some good, helpful information on grief, on coping, and all of the above. So many of you who might be in our audience, you could be some of our presenters over the years, and we'll be reaching out to you and building a, a robust calendar of presentations that are supportive to people in their grief. Um, so I am delighted to be here and to present today on giving grief and healthy coping a language. Now, for many years, I've been presenting on topics similar to this and really interested in this idea of the language that we use around grief, how we identify grief and think about grief and talk about grief, and what we believe the nature of grief to be in our lives and how grief manifests in our lives. The idea of the language of grief isn't something that I developed myself. I first encountered it many years ago when I was the executive director of the Amelia Center in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a bereavement center there connected to Children's Hospital of Alabama that provides counseling to parents grieving the death of a child and to children and teenagers grieving the death of a parent. And there was a mom's group that I was facilitated for several years when I was there. Sometimes we would meet during lunch, sometimes it was an evening group. It sort of moved and shifted over the years. And at one point, we got a call from a lady by the name of Ann Hood. Many of you may be familiar with Ann. Ann is the author of many books, many fiction books, but also the author of a book called Comfort, and a book called The Knitting Circle. And she was on a tour with her book, The Knitting Circle. And it was, I believe it was a few years after the death of her child. And I remember her reaching out because she noticed an advertisement for our mom's group and she liked to connect with her people when she was in different towns. And she asked if she could actually move her book signing to the Amelia Center and give proceeds to the Amelia Center. And so we planned an evening with her and she came over. And she said many significant things in her talk and reading from her book that night. But the one thing that really stuck out to me was the way she opened. She stood up in front of the group of people that were there and she said, I'm a writer, I'm a person of words. I've written many books. But when it came to grief, I realized that grief lacks a language. She just couldn't find the right words to articulate what is grief. And I know many of us can relate to that when we experience our loss and we're trying to help others around us understand what it is we're going through. And it just you can't get it. You can't understand grief related to certain types of situations unless you have lived that situation. So here is this mother trying to explain to people what it is like to have a child die, but trying to explain it to people who haven't had that experience. And they're just the inability for people to understand. But then it also captured my attention because not just because of the struggle of trying to help other people understand, but her own struggle to find her own language around what she was going through, particularly in the backdrop of a society that has a lot of different concepts and ideas of what that is, and it's out there. And when we look at it, we wonder, is that me? So I wanted to present this particular topic early in my time with Compassionate Friends because it really looks at both grief and healthy coping and the language we use around it, which I think matters. I think it matters that we are being clear about what we are attempting to say is happening in our lives to other people, but also giving ourselves a language, words that connect with that. And I'll talk about that as we go along and the power of being able to name what it is you're experiencing. It gives you just a little bit of personal agency in that. When I can give it a name, I can define it. It gives me something more concrete that I can hold on to. So I'm going to do this in really two parts. I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so just about grief and understanding grief and what is grief. And I'm going to dispel some myths that I believe our society has around grief and bereavement that I think continues to perpetuate some of the misgivings, the misunderstandings, the sense that people are alone in their grief, or they're not doing it right because society says it should be this. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to shift gears, and we'll spend about 20, 30 minutes talking about, well, what's the language for healthy coping? Because again, our society has lots of ideas. I'm sure you've had people come to you and say, well, here's what you should do. You should do this or do that or do. We have advice coming at us from all around us. And some of it is okay and some of it is not. And I don't know about you, I don't actually receive advice very well, particularly when it's a finger pointing advice. Um, I learn better when I can hear someone else talk about their experience, what it is that they found to be helpful, and then I have a chance to decide whether that is helpful to me. So I'll spend some time talking about some of this idea of healthy coping. What does that look like? And then hopefully at the end of it, we can have a language. Um, and I want to say a couple of things up front, though. I don't need you to adopt my language. I'm simply going to share some ideas around language that maybe is a better fit, but we each have to identify our own language around it. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later when I'm talking about healthy coping. I really believe that a big part of coping is naming it and giving it that language. So let's just jump right in and we're going to talk a little bit about grief. I want to start with this statement. I'm going to read it to you. I know it's on the screen, but I just want to read this statement about our society and about some of the constructs. Many of the societal constructs for understanding grief do not adequately reflect the experience of grieving people. As a result, many bereaved people feel isolated, vulnerable, and misunderstood. This often results in people internalizing their feelings and hiding their grief from others. Now, I believe this to be true, that some of the constructs have created a scenario where we just simply go, well, something must be wrong with me. My family keeps telling me I need to do this. Every time I try to talk to my friends, it seems like either they don't want to hear or they just don't get it. So I'll just stop talking about it. And what happens is that grief doesn't go away. Grief is actually enduring, and we'll talk about that. But that my grief becomes private grief. And the reality is that private grief or private pain, maybe another way to look at it, private pain is not the absence of grief. It's grief. Right. So some of us may have found ourselves out in public and someone a few months out, or maybe a couple of years out, and someone says, "Oh, you look so great. You're doing so well. I just don't know. I don't know how you're doing it. I don't think I could do whatever." All the things we hear people say, right? And we hear people say this, and we're thinking, "Man, if you only knew, you're just seeing what's on the outside. You only knew that I am grieving and I do carry my grief." Um, but again, unless you've lived it, you just don't get it. And then we have these conflicting messages from our society. And so as a result of hiding our grief, quite often you have this isolation, vulnerability, and feeling misunderstood, that some of the other things that people have shared with me over the years being their experience and just from my own experience with loss, exhausted. I feel exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and physically taxed. I just can't take one more thing. I'm at my capacity here. Um, Feeling disempowered, not knowing what to do to make it better. I'm just, is this it? This is what I have to carry from here forward. What's next? Feeling unsupported, like no one understands me. I don't know anyone else. I'm isolated. I'm alone. Feeling conflicted just because of the mixed messages that we get from family members and loved ones, friends, or even just acquaintances. Disenfranchised, believing that your experience isn't valid because it doesn't fit one of the societal norms or what's expected of a person after a profound loss. Or just feeling victimized, struggling with a sense of being a victim, particularly if your loss is associated with a type of loss where there was a victimization that happened. Someone did something and now my person has died. And we carry this sense that I have been, it's we're not just grieving, we also now have a grievance. I'm carrying my grievance and my grief. I'm grieving the death of my child, my sibling, my grandchild, my person, and I have this grievance against this other person who did something that caused the death of my person, right? Or just feeling maladjusted, feeling like something's wrong with me. Well, if this is what society says grief should be like, maybe it's me. If this is what everyone else is experiencing, maybe something's wrong with me and I'm not doing it right. Right. Um, let's look at some of these myths that I think create some of this reaction in us when we are grieving. One of the myths is that grief rolls out in a predictable way. This is typically reflected by ideas around like stages of grief. Our good friend David Kessler has said for years, stages of grief, it's not a predictable set of stages that you walk through. That as he wrote about stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the work that they did, it really was about experiences that we have in our grief, and it shouldn't um, be associated with this sense of, well, you go through this phase, then this phase, then this phase, and this is the way you move through. Because the reality is that grief is actually dynamic and complex. You can't capture it by a stage or a phase or any really prescriptive models that we try to put out there. When we do that, what happens is we find ourselves saying, you know, I thought I got over my anger 2 years ago, and now I'm angry again. And we start seeing it as a setback because we see grief on this continuum that I'm supposed to be moving forward. The reality is that grief is more cyclical than it is linear. Think about our lives just in general. Aren't they more cyclical, more a cyclical than they are a line, a straight line. And I understand. Every year we age, every year we get further from the events that happened in our past. I understand how that works. But the reality is, we live in a cyclical society. Think about it. We measure our time by years. And every year the seasons come around. It's a cycle. Every year our birthday comes around. The birthday of our person comes around. Anniversaries and holidays come back around. We live in a cycle, not a straight line. We actually are our, you know, nature itself is cyclical, right? I talked about the seasons, but we're spinning and we have day and night, and it comes back around. We are cycling the sun. We have our 365 days. Um, and so I think in some ways, this idea of thinking of things as a predictable, we're moving forward, here's how you move forward. And if you experience grief down here, then you must have done something wrong back here, rather than just simply recognizing that grief is a cyclical experience. It's something that is cycling in our life, and it's not something that goes away or we get over or we move beyond. It's something that we learn to carry in our lives. Um, and we revisit certain things. I had a lady years ago said to me, Andy, I think I'm stuck in the anger stage. And I asked her, I said, well, tell me a little bit about what you mean by that. And she was talking about some things going on in her life that she was angry about. And I said, it kind of sounds like to me you're angry, not stuck in anger, but you're angry. And it sounds to me the things you're angry about are things that people tend to get angry about. So we were able to then, once she could accept that she wasn't stuck in anger, but that she was experiencing anger, then she could decide, well, then what do I do? How do I behave in the midst of this anger that I'm experiencing in my life, right? Another myth is that grief is a minor disruption and it's time limited. Uh, this is probably, in my opinion, one of the most destructive myths in our society. That yes, it's going to turn your life upside down for a little bit of time, but in time you'll find your footing again, and you'll be okay. And we kind of tout that to people. And what happens is, then when people get to the end of that timeline and they're still experiencing the intensity of their profound loss, we start to think, well, it must be me. If other people seem to be getting on with their lives. I call it the Facebook effect. You go on Facebook and it seems like all these people have their lives all together and they have only wonderful things happening, right? Because we're posting all the great things that happen in our life. And it creates this mythological world that really doesn't exist for anyone. I've been in doing this long enough. I've sat with thousands of individuals and families over the years. And I can tell you, no one is immune to pain and grief and loss. It's just not a thing that exists. But we look at this and we see it and we think something must be wrong with me because it should just be a little more minor than it is. The reality, though, is that grief is a major disruption. It challenges all sorts of things in our lives, our identity, our relationships, our beliefs, our assumptions about the world, and even our role in that world. All of that gets turned upside down. And it's non-finite. There's not a set ending to what that looks like. It is an experience that we are living and we are being impacted and really changed through it. And I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Another myth is that bereaved people must get over their grief or move on from their grief. And I already talked about this idea that somehow at some point you just have to move on or you just get over it or you got to let it go. You hear all these messages from people. Um, when the reality is that grief isn't something we get over or we let go, it's actually natural and it's non pathological. Loss is inevitable, it's universal, it's a human experience, it's normal, and it's really more of an adaptive response to loss. than it is this idea that I have to get over it somehow or put it behind me, right? Remember, we live in a cyclical way. And so we carry the things with us from our past. And our grief, most of our grief, for most of us, our grief is tied to a relationship. And quite often a relationship that we had invested in, that where we invested in loving that person. And just because a person dies doesn't mean that our love for that person dies. And so our grief endures. Um, Grief is something that isn't time limited. It is enduring. And then finally, this myth that grief that is too intense or does not follow the majority societal norms is abnormal. Uh, Grief is personal and it's contextual. So the duration, the intensity, the experience of grief, it's unique to each person. There isn't a bell curve of where you should fall in your grief, right? Here's where the majority of people find themselves. That's where you should be. The reality is that grief is a personal experience. One of the things when I'm training people how to facilitate support groups, one of the things I say to professionals, if they haven't had that loss, is I say, your challenge in facilitating this group is that you haven't experienced this loss. So you have to be appropriate in focusing on being the facilitator, not the guru of knowledge about grief and about anyone's grief in that room, because you haven't had that loss, unless the professional has. But many times professionals might be leading a group and they haven't had that particular loss. What I say to folks who have had that loss, your challenge becomes not assuming that everyone in that room has experienced it the same way you have. Their story is their story. It's not your story. Their grief is their grief, and it's personal, and it's contextual. And we want to hold space to get to know what that looks like, as opposed to assuming it right into that space. So these mischaracterizations often lead to, here's some of the phrases you hear people say. People will say stages or phases. You ever heard someone talk about grief recovery, or closure and moving on? These are some of the language that is associated with some of these mischaracterizations. Complicated grief, prolonged grief, these are all words associated. And as I looked at these over the years, it came to my attention that, wait a minute, there's something that this type of approach has in common. And one of the things I think that this approach has in common is it is leaning into our society's need to restore things back to the way they were. You hear this a lot. You ever watch the TV shows on HGTV where they're going to restore a house to its original condition, right? Um, I love watching the shows. I like watching how it's transformed, right? This is before and this is after. Here's my question. Do they ever return the house back to its original condition? Is it ever restored? And I think the answer is no. I have never watched one of those shows where they restored it back to its original condition. I have watched shows where they have transformed it into something different. So I think it's this need to restore things back, this idea of restoration. So here's some of these restorative constructs. We need to remove grief. We need to remove painful memories, remove the struggle. We need to restore to wholeness. We need to fix problems, treat an illness, use like a medical model, look at symptomology. Maybe there's a pathology to it, and we need to discover what that is and treat that and get you back to your baseline, right? Um, the problem is a restorative construct, it does not recognize the reality of grief. Grief is not a restorative process. Grief is actually a transformative process. Now, I love to use images to kind of talk about these things. And I love this image of this palm tree. I don't even remember where I picked it up, but it's just such a beautiful view of this palm tree kind of growing out over this inlet, and then the shape of it is so interesting, right? And so it just had to capture this picture. Well, here's some things that I know about palm trees. I actually live in Florida. I grew up in Florida, grew up around a lot of palm trees, and it's probably true for other trees as well, but I know that it's true for palm trees. When I see a tree like this, a palm tree, what I know to be true is that this palm tree at some point was in a horrific storm. It endured some sort of storm with strong winds that blew, and that palm tree held on as tight as it could, as hard as it could hold on through that storm, battering that tree. And then when the storm was over, the tree was here, the tree ended up here at a slant, and it probably happened somewhere around the bend. See that bend where it starts growing up? Probably in its life cycle, right about that bend is when it endured that storm. The other thing that we know to be true about palm trees is that palm trees don't grow sideways, they grow up. So this tree being laid like this, no one ever came, picked it straight up. It just stayed here. It continued to grow, and as it did, it grew up, and it transformed the palm tree into a different condition than it was in. And to me, this is a better picture, a better construct for understanding what grief is. That grief is an experience that we live that transforms us. I had a mom who put it to me this way. She said, Andy, after my daughter died, it was like a veil was lifted, and I saw the world in a way that I never saw it before. At first, it was unusual, and I didn't know what to do. I was confused and hurt and in pain and struggling, and I had to learn how to live in that new reality. I think that's a better image of grief than this idea that my person died, and now I have this condition that I need to have treated so I can get my life back to the way it was. I have rarely encountered a person who has experienced profound loss that has said to me, Andy, I got my life back to the way it was. What I have had are thousands of conversations with people who say, I am in a different place than I was in before my loss. And it's all sorts of all types of experiences and things that a person goes through. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when we talk about coping as well. So instead of this idea of restoration, I really I I hold to a transformative model when it comes to grief and loss. And to me, the question isn't, are you being transformed by your loss? I believe you are being transformed. The question, I believe, is, do you want to be an active participant in your transformation? Because we all know that we can experience profound loss in our lives, and it doesn't mean that we're just going to naturally transform in healthy ways. So we have to be active participants. That's why coping is such an important part of this conversation. We need to understand what grief is so that we can validate our experience and give ourselves some credit and say, oh, okay, so I'm not losing my mind. Something's not wrong with me. I'm experiencing something in life that is enduring, disruptive, horrific, whatever words you want to use, painful, all of those things that it is, and it is impacting me as a person. Um, so think about the definition of transformation and how it fits, I think, so much better. The definition is to change in composition or structure, to change the outward form or appearance, or to change in character or condition. Now, I've had, again, all sorts of statements people have made to me. I had a dad one time who told me, he said, Andy, he said, you didn't know me before my child died, my son died. He said, um, but don't get me wrong, I would give anything to have my son back and to have not experienced that. He said, at the same time, I I actually like the person I am now better than the person I was before my son died. Now I know not everyone would say that. Some people would say the opposite. But here's this gentleman trying to explain something that he's not glad his son died. At the same time, I'm not the same person, right? And there's this um kind of catch to it. Like what does this mean for me? And what does that look like for my life? Some of the areas that are transformed in our grief are our roles and responsibilities, our rituals, our routines, our expectations, even our values can shift, our beliefs and our agency, our just personal sense of agency, our safety and well-being, our meaning and purpose, our self-image, our personal outlook are impacted, our relationships and our social life. And I'm sure there's others we could add here. These were just a few of the areas that I thought of. So if you think about it, our grief is disruptive and it is transformational and it transforms us in so many different areas of our lives. Think about people who say, I'm so exhausted in my grief. It's because of the energy that grief is taking. It's the impact that that loss has had on our life. It is a transformation, and a transformation is is hard. It's not an easy thing. Um, it is a hard road. You think about two roads in the woods. It's the road less traveled, right? It's that road that's hard to walk. And then just a few things that grief is transformative experience. And just to reemphasize some of the things we already talked about. And I have some slides that go into detail about this. I'm glad to share those. I'll make the slides available in a PDF to everyone. And we can send an email out to everyone who attended and let you have access to the slides. But I'll just use this slide to hit just each one of these because I want to now shift and talk a little bit about coping. But grief is a transformative experience that is enduring, that's disruptive, that's personal. Remember, we talked about it belongs to the person who's grieving. It's not my grief or your grief, it's their grief. Grief is transitional. It's moving from one way of being in the world to another way of being in the world. It transitions. Grief is integral. This is one that sometimes can be a hard concept to understand. But our goal in life isn't to get rid of grief because grief isn't something we get rid of. The goal becomes how do I integrate that loss into my life? And that doesn't mean it's easy. Piaget gave us a model of adaptation. It's learning theory, where when you encounter something new, the struggle that happens as you attempt to adapt that new experience, that new thing, or that new knowledge into your life and what that looks like. Um, Piaget said if you take a rattle and you put it in the hand of an infant, the infant's going to grab it and it's going to put it right into its mouth, grab and bite. He calls that a, a construct, right? And so it's grab and bite, and it works every time. The infant knows how to do that. You put the infant on the living room floor and it's crawling around, and it comes upon a wristwatch that fell off someone's arm. It's never seen a wristwatch before, so it's a new object. It has to adapt that object. Piaget said it will use its existing constructs to interact. So it's going to grab it and bite it. And he calls that assimilation. It's taking a new experience and assimilating it into our understanding of the world, but it's typically using things we know that have helped in the past or we've used in the past, and then it adapts that new object. Piaget said, though, that there's a more challenging type of adaptation, and that is accommodation. And that means it's when that infant's on the floor and it crawls and it comes upon a beach ball, and the beach ball is too big for it to grab. So it tries to employ grab and bite. It can't get its mouth around the beach ball. It bounces away, and the infant struggles. So it's this, he called it the struggle with the beach ball, or that struggle is a part of adaptation when it comes to accommodating. And what he said meant by that was sometimes we have to develop new pathways in our mind, new abilities. new ways of seeing things or experiencing the world, new coping mechanisms, because the ones I had that worked for these things don't work for this. And and he actually calls it this, the process of growth, that I'm growing as a person. I'm learning new ways to be in the world and new ways to be with that beach ball. And in time, I learn I can hold it and I can bounce it. And so now I've developed a new way of understanding and interacting with the world. So recognizing how grief is integral, it's an integral part of the person that we're becoming. And how do we integrate grief into our lives? And then the last two, grief is visible and it's invisible. It's the image of the iceberg. You know, an iceberg, 70% of that iceberg is under the surface. You only see the tip of the iceberg, right? Outside of the surface. So the people in our lives, when we're grieving, are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. They're not seeing what's way down below surface, right? And even some of us may not fully understand what's happening under the surface of our lives, right? Because grief is sometimes visible and sometimes it's invisible. Um, Remember, silent grief or silent pain is not absent grief, absent pain. And then lastly, grief is a shared experience. And this really kind of moves us to the idea of coping because we aren't alone in our grief. I know it's personal, and in that sense, we have our own personal experience. And grief also is a shared experience. We don't just grieve in a vacuum. There are other people who have walked where we walk or are walking where we walk. They may have their unique experience, but we can sit in a room with other people who peers who have had a similar loss, and we can sit in there, we can nod our head as they're talking. Yeah, yeah, me too. Yes, that's been my experience. Yes. And we can be validated in our grief. I personally believe that grief longs to be validated. It longs to be witnessed, longs to be understood. We just want someone to get us, right? And so grief is that shared experience that we have. Now, these are the slides that accompany these. I'm not going to go through each one, but I wanted to include them in this deck because when you get it, I wanted you to have some notes on each of those items. So we think about grief not as an illness, not as something that's temporary disruption. Grief is a major disruption. It is an experience that we live. It is not a problem that we solve. It's an experience that we live, that we adapt, that becomes part of our story, that we grow on top of, we grow with, all of those things, however you would view it in that way. And really, if our society could just as a whole grab a hold of that type of paradigm around grief, we would have more places that we feel comfortable grieving around people because we're teaching this construct about grief. Um, and there are many of us out there who are carrying the message as much as we can, who have cared for many years. For me, really, my entry into grief was the death of my cousin when I was 18 years old and he was 19. He died from suicide. And I remember at the graveside service, they ushered us all away at the end. And I remember my aunt, though, stayed back behind, and none of us knew she had stayed, but she was there on her knees and she was wailing, not crying, wailing. You know, there's a difference. It was this utterance from deep down inside, and this is her son. And I remember two gentlemen came kind of out of nowhere, knelt down beside her and scooped her up under her arms. And I remember again, this is just my image all these years later of her sort of being carried away from there. And I remember thinking as an 18-year-old, I don't know what the right thing was at this moment, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't it. Why couldn't she have done what she needed? She wasn't hurting anyone. This is her son. There's somehow was a different approach, and that has impacted my life in the direction and trajectory of my life in spending all of these years in bereavement support. It has defined the way I think about what grief is in people's lives. That need to make space for ourselves to experience our grief and be patient with ourselves and allow that to happen. And others should allow that as well, in my opinion. So let's talk about coping after profound loss. And I personally think that grief and coping that they're interconnected. Um, we're either coping in ways that are healthy or maybe ways that aren't healthy. But it's sort of human nature to do things in reaction to the pain and that we're experiencing, right? So there are ways that we can cope that might not be helping us, that might be hurting us, and there are ways that we can cope that might be helpful to us as well. Um, Obviously, just like grief, coping is also personal. The same things don't work for everyone. So I want to talk about some general things that I've picked up over the years. Again, people have told me this is heard lots of stories. This is helpful for my own life, things that I have found to be helpful in the losses that I've experienced, and just share some of these thoughts and ideas with you. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We have about 20 minutes, so I'll give about 20 minutes of ideas around this. But I think the key to all of it, any type of coping, is our own personal agency. It's somehow recognizing that grief is not a choice. Let me just be very clear about this. The pain that we experience in grief is not a choice, it's a reality, it's an experience. Okay. The choice is how we, what we choose to do with ourselves in the midst of that grief and that pain. So it's leaning into our personal agency while grieving. And I think that's the foundation to me of most healthy coping is that we first have to recognize that even in the midst of this struggle and this pain, there are, albeit maybe small, choices that I have that I can put into place. And almost, is it Megan Devine in her book, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, who says, do it like if you can't do it any other way, do it like a science experiment. Let me try this and jot down how that worked or didn't work. Let me try this, see how that worked. However you have to do that, it really starts with that idea of leaning into our own ability to choose our behaviors in any given circumstance. So one of the first things I want to talk about is I think a great coping, a way to healthy cope is to find a community of support. Now, you're going to say, well, you're saying this because you're the CEO of the Compassionate Friends, and the Compassionate Friends creates a community for support. Well, I have to tell you, I've only been the CEO of Compassionate Friends for a few months, and I have been saying this for 30 years. Finding a community is so helpful. Yes, what Compassionate Friends does works. Peer support works. And it works for many reasons. One reason is because of what I said earlier. A person who hasn't experienced that particular loss can't fully understand. They can care, they can empathize, they can sympathize, all of those things, but they may not be able to fully understand because they haven't experienced it. There's some power in being in safe, sacred space with other people who you don't have to explain it. They get it because they've lived it. Peer support. So if you can find a way to connect with peer support, whether that's an in-person group or it's online, it could be a Facebook group, it could be um, a uh, it could be a virtual support group. Any way that you can connect with the community. It could be having coffee on a regular basis with someone else who's had a similar loss, or maybe a group of people, whatever that looks like. Finding a community of support, and that first one is peer support. Now, there's also a way to expand our community even beyond peer support, right? Um, Colin Campbell, who wrote the book Finding the Words, he was a keynote at one of our past conferences. And I remember lots of things that Colin said stuck with me, and I'm a huge fan. Um, but what really stuck with me and what he had to say, and in reading his book, was how he focuses on building your community. And he talks about inviting some of the people in his life who don't understand because they haven't had the loss, but who he felt like or feels like are worth being part of his life and him worth trying to help them understand. Read the book. It's a great book to find your way to do that. But the reality is, there are people who haven't had your specific loss who care and that you can have as part of your community. Some of these people may be friends or neighbors or people you just enjoy being around. Those are wonderful things. You also might find these people in other places. You might find them in literature and books. That can be part of your community. I know that when I read authors like Hope Edelman and Colin Campbell and David Kessler and so many really great authors and thinkers in our field, I feel like I know these people as I'm reading this book because I relate to what they're saying. So they become part of my support community. Seminars and trainings, just like we're doing right now, just someone sharing some thoughts and ideas, whether we accept those ideas or not. They may not exactly apply, but we can take them and say, well, how does that apply to my situation? Does that fit? And does that work for me and my situation? And then memorial gatherings, just opportunities to remember. Every year, Compassionate Friends participates in candlelight, worldwide candlelighting, the second Sunday of December, remembering children who have died, remembering our children and our siblings and our grandchildren and honoring their memory, right? Just participating in those things. And then, of course, individual counseling. Counseling, therapy aren't negative things. Even though grief isn't a mental illness, it doesn't mean we can't be helped by finding that person who we can trust to listen to us, just talk through things. Sometimes just to you hear yourself say it out loud and it comes back to you and you understand things in a different way because you have that opportunity to do that. So if you haven't done it, begin thinking about, put it on paper. What would my community of support look like? Jot that down. If you've gone to individual counseling and you haven't found it yet, keep trying. Sometimes I think of individual counseling like going and buy a new suit or a new set of clothes. It doesn't always fit. And so it's okay. It's not offensive to the counselor to go, there's not a connection here. But I will tell you, when you do find that person, it can be life changing to have that connection. Same with support groups. You might go to one and it just, for whatever reason, that group didn't fit. Keep trying to find that space because when you do, it can be life changing to be with other people who get it. Another thing that we can do in our coping is to just give our grief a language. Like give grief and coping both a language. Write it. I started by saying that grief lacks a language. And quite often when we can't name what's happening to us, it 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 has more power over us. But when I can begin to give it some words, I'm now part of the narrative. I'm defining this in some way. So write it, speak it, process it. That's kind of opposite. Society's telling us, well, stop thinking about it, go think about something else. Society says, stop ruminating and do this instead. And the reality is, it's not that we're waking up and choosing to ruminate, it's that our person is still a part of our life. Our grief is a part of our life, and it's demanding our attention. And so give it, process it, feel it. Imagine, imagine what healthy coping might look like. I've had people over the years who've said, Andy, I just, I've tried all these things and none of them work. And I'll say, well, let's do something different then. Let's imagine that there are some things that could work. What would those things be? Right? Imagine what it might look like if you can grieve and you can also experience joy at the same time. Just imagine it to start with, right? And if you're at a place where it's unimaginable now, that's okay. Let that go. Just go, okay, I can't do the imagine thing right now because there are periods in our grief where we just can't see anything else. And what we need there is patience with ourselves. We need people around us to be patient, and we need to be patient with ourselves as well. And we need to show ourselves grace, is another good way to put it. Contemplate grief, contemplate coping, consider options, allow yourself to actually participate in those things, allow yourself to accept that invitation, even though it may be hard. And then just experience life, experience your grief, but also get out and experience, just get outside, walk through nature, experience other things in life. I had a lady who told me years ago, she said, when I get really depressed, Andy, I go to the mall and every third person I pass by, I think to myself, that person's going through something really, really difficult. And it makes me feel less alone because the reality is that most people are going through something difficult. We just don't know it on the outside. And so she's just allowing herself to get out there. Now, I'm going to go back to this writing. Even if you can't start with anything else, start by thinking of words that truly describe your grief and get beyond the words sad, mad, afraid. Like there's other words like jealous and exhausted, and like give your grief some words. And you don't have to write a book. You can. There's been some really great books written out of people's pain that have been helpful to other people. But I'm just talking about just putting down words. Just jot some words down so that you can have those. I love this quote from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And he's talking about here that idea of personal agency, that most often in life things happen and we react. We don't pause and we don't acknowledge that space. Well, grief tends to slow us down in the sense that that's kind of all we can consume at certain points in our life. It's overwhelming and it's all of those things. And in a way, we're kind of existing in that space of this is how what I'm experiencing. Now, what do I do with that? What's next? What are my choices involved here? So circumstances, then your personal agency, then your action response. So that what this quote from Frankel, what Frankel was suggesting is that instead of just reacting in life, let's 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 step into that space and let's respond, not react. Um, One of the ways we can start doing this is indeed leaning into that reality of our loss, recognizing the irreversibility of the past, um, dealing with this fear that we sometimes have with not being able to move forward. Sometimes we avoid the pain of our grief. We avoid our grief and leaning into it because we're afraid if I go there, I'll never get back out. Um, Many people who have struggled with that, it's normal to have that struggle. Also, it's a reality that as we lean into our grief, though, many people have found that not only do they they're able to find space where they can experience joy and happiness and things like that, but they recognize that by leaning into it, it's not just controlling them. They have a little bit more of a say in their lives. Expressing the realities in writing, I talked about that. Taking responsibility for our choices, we talked about that. Allowing room for experiences other than grief, giving ourselves permission to have those experiences as well. As it's hard, it's very hard. I had a mom who described it to me as she said, I kept teaching vacation Bible school after my daughter died. I did it for the last 2 or 3 years, and she had just come to me for counseling that morning, and she said, I just have to tell you, this third year doing vacation Bible school, I was kind of just faking it the last 2 years. I have felt fully present again in doing vacation Bible school. And she couldn't really point to why that was the reality. It more, we just spent the rest of the session with her just kind of going back and going through her entire story that really carried her to that point. And one of the things she decided was, I just decided I was going to keep doing certain things, even though I didn't feel like doing it. And so she was making a choice, not based on her feelings, but a choice based on what she believed was the right thing for her in that moment. And then taking part in meaningful experiences in life. And it may not feel meaningful to begin with. It may not ever feel meaningful. Maybe it'll shift and something else becomes meaningful. But it's opening up ourselves to those opportunities. This is Viktor Frankl. I just wanted to point out his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Don't be thrown off by the title. It really applies to everyone. Viktor Frankl was in those who may not know him, he was in the death camps in World War II. And uh, his entire family died in those camps except for Victor. He survived. And in the camps, he had to find a way that he could experience meaning, even though he was in the midst of unbearable suffering. And he found it in creativity. He said by creating a work or doing a deed, he found that when he was assigned work by the Nazis or by the camp officials, camp people in charge of the camp, he he found that if he would just focus in and do the best job he could do at that work, he actually was able to find meaning in the work that he did. He could dig a perfect hole. He could clean a beautiful kitchen, right? Whatever that was. He also found it by experiencing something or encountering someone. He talked about that as relationships, his relationship with the world around him, his relationship with animals, with people, all of that became important to him. And then finally, his control of his attitude, the attitude he took in the midst of his circumstances. He said everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, is the way that he put it. Now, how do I know these things? I won't spend much time on this slide, but I will include it in the deck, is really determining what are the things I can control and what are the things I can't control. Because if I can't control it, I can experience it, right? And I may have to still carry it and experience it. But there are these other things that I can control and do something about. And as I learn both nuances, that these experiences still demand attention, even though I can't control them, and I still have these things that I can do and these choices that I can make. Another just good thought about healthy coping is just to establish routines and predictability. Grief robs us of our sense of predictability. It reminds us that people who we love in our lives can die, and that is disruptive on numerous levels. But as we can begin to create a routine, whether it's whether it's restoring routines, maybe that works for some, but just creating those routines. What would they look like for me now? What does a day, a week, a month, a year look like? What are the rituals that I'm going to bring in and have to be part of that? My morning routines, nighttime rituals, planned meals, outings. What do all of those look like? And taking hold of those. Another thing is to just question our own perspective in our loss. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on these slides. These will be part of your deck. But ask yourself what you see in these pictures. Each of these pictures actually have two different pictures intertwined. And quite often, people can only see one of them. And sometimes in our own pain, we narrow our world so much that we can't see anything else. And we won't open ourselves up to any other perspectives. Sometimes we stay so focused on our feelings and trying to figure out our feelings, we don't go back and say, well, what are the thoughts that are driving my feelings? So some of that is just that perspective building that we can do. And just a couple more items. I know we're at the end of our time. A couple more things to consider. One is to consider this act of mindfulness. Now, when I was a kid, and most of us who are my age or older, we didn't have to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is just something we had to do because we had a lot of time on our hands and we would find ourselves bored and we would have to focus on that moment and figure out what am I going to do with this space? I didn't have anything to distract me. I have to figure out what I'm going to do with it. And that's really the practice of mindfulness. There's a really great book I would recommend. It's called Flow, the psychology of optimal experience. It was written back in 1990. Um, and Mahali says in this book, I think he was one of the first to really talk about, at least in the Western society. Eastern society has talked about mindfulness for many, many hundreds of years. But really bringing it into Western society is one of the first I heard talk about this idea of flow state, of learning how to just focus on the moment I'm in. I can't control the past. I really can't control all the outcomes in the future. I can only control my inputs. What am I going to do next? What's my next behavior? What's my next act, the next thing I'm going to do? And so learning how to be intentional. I talked about expressing it, I talked about talking about it and telling someone. And then I wanted to just close with this. If you're in your grief and part of your grief is a sense of guilt that you carry. Now, I will just say this. Many people I have known over the years, guilt doesn't have to be rational. It's just an experience that we live. And most people who are parents, you can try as much as you want to say to a parent that it's not their fault, but it doesn't matter. You're wired as the parent to feel like there's something you can always do, and that's how we're made. And so, guilt can be a very normal experience for a parent or a sibling or a grandparent or really anyone grieving the death of a person. So, I like to use the word leaning into forgiveness, not just forgive yourself because it's not that easy, but leaning into this concept of grace for yourself and for others. Here's a couple of ways to think about it. Let the past be your teacher, not your judge. Allow for second chances. Give yourself the grace to allow yourself the opportunity to continue from this day and forward and how you're going to choose to live your life. And in part of it as well, just making room for growth in your life. So I changed my picture as we close from the picture of a gentleman sitting by himself watching a sunset to the picture of a person leaning to pull another person up the mountain. I hope that you know that in the midst of coping with your loss, that you are not alone, that at the Compassionate Friends, we walk with you, that we're here to support and to care and to validate and to listen. Encourage you to check out our website, plug into the resources that we have available from online groups to in-person chapter meetings. And I want to just on behalf of our thousands of volunteers and our staff, I want to just express my gratitude for you being here today. I'm not happy for the reason that you're here, but I'm glad that you found us. And I hope that you will plug in to support as you walk your journey of grief, and walk it with others who understand. So thank you, and I bid you all a peaceful rest of your day.